if someone were to make the argument that 2023 would be a horrible year to do writing or to do poetry, like, are there any reasons you can think of not to do poetry this upcoming year? And you can
I
say
mean,
no.
no. I mean, only if like you have like some kind of other engagement, other thing that is going to prioritize your time that has, a higher priority.
Having
You know what
kids.
I mean? Yeah, yeah. So I was just like, yeah, I could either like write poems or like I could like take care of my kids. It's just like, well,
Poems.
I think you've chosen wisely with the kids. I mean, I don't know. It depends on the kid, maybe. Like, let me take a look at the kid first. Let me see if it's like worth it. But no, like, yeah, I mean, outside of that, I mean, if you have poems in you, if you have poems to write, and again, there's like, I don't know. I think we are having this discussion one time. We did Quatrain, and Quatrain was a really cool event. It was a day full of like kind of lectures, and it was just kind of talking about poetry. And I remember there was a woman, I can't remember her name. But I remember her, we kind of broached the subject, and it was maybe during Ajane's where it was like talking about like kind of the ethics and like what poems to write. And I remember thinking to myself, like, yeah, like, it hasn't always been like this, but especially like at this stage in my life, I'm like, there's not a single poem that if it came to me that I wouldn't at least create. You know what I mean? Like it might have been like the worst and most offensive poem. Like I might not ever release it. It
You
might
don't
not
just
ever
share
go
it.
anywhere. You know what I mean? But there's like I can't really think of anything that I'm like, okay, I would not at the very least create. And maybe the boundaries that I have are uh, maybe looser than maybe other people might have, and maybe that's for good reason. I don't know, but I just can't really see myself like, okay, being like I can't create something, even if it means that I never release it. And I think that's like a really important thing for artists to keep in mind, just like in line with your question, like like if I have a poem, if there's like a thing that I thought that I'm like, man, that would be a good poem. How can I create that? I'm like, I don't think it does. It doesn't do anybody any good in your head just staying there. And maybe at the very least, if you get it down on the page, it's like, okay, it's out of my system. Or maybe you find a nugget in there that you can use, or maybe you use the whole thing. Who the heck? I don't. Who the heck knows? But yeah, I think that there's really no reason to be like, okay, I'm swearing off poetry in the next year. And there's only more and more provocation to really get engaged with it. But I mean, what about you? I mean, is there any reasons maybe I'm missing?
No, I think that's interesting what you said about, even if it's not necessarily the poem you want it to be, just still getting it out there. There's
Yeah,
you know, again, I'm doing a lot with like YouTube video, just for my business, and there's a very common refrain that, hey, like, how do you get started? You make 100 crappy videos, and I think it's very the same thing with like poetry. You have to write 100 bad poems, like really awful poems, and if you haven't started writing, well, maybe now's a good time to start. I do think I would definitely say 2023, if you feel a calling towards poetry, I would definitely say move towards it. But I would also ask you to kind of, I think a lot of times, especially when people are getting started, they're just kind of writing poems. There's not really an end goal. It's just like, I'm just going to write the poem. I'm just going to write the poem. I'm just going to write the poem. If you talk to a lot of the bigger names in poetry, and I'm thinking larger work. I'm thinking collections now. Like, so
yeah,
you have all these poems. What are you going to do with them? I feel like there's two big trains of thought. There's the one hand that people are like, when you write a lot of poems, there's going to be some obsessions and some common themes that come up. So then you just kind of naturally turn those into collections. I was having a conversation with Ruth Awad, and she was mentioning that. Um, Conversely, when I was at Cave, a big thing that they're pushing is, books are project pieces. So it's a different way of writing for me than I typically approach it. But one thing they're really pushing is no, like when you're writing poems, having a specific goal in mind, like, hey, this is going to be part of this collection. I'm writing pieces that are going to fit in this book I'm going to make. So it's going to be all unified themes. So it's like it kind of changes your whole approach, because suddenly, I think a lot of times when people think poetry, just think like, okay, whatever comes to mind, this is going to be whatever comes to the piece. Whereas this is much more directed, and I don't think forced is the right way, but almost more like curated, or
Yeah.
navigate. Like I don't know what the best word is, but it's certainly a different approach than I typically go about it because I'm usually much more. Hey, the poem that's going to come is going to be the poem that comes, and I don't really. I feel like I'm more like the vessel or the instrument than the actual person in charge. But this is
Hmm.
much more giving the writer a lot more agency. I feel.
Well, it's kind of like it's kind of hard to kind of put into words, but essentially, if you are not the instrument, so to speak, but you're like you can decide what instrument's being played. So I mean, if there's like a specific thing that you're trying to tackle, like maybe you're like, okay, I'm trying to tackle parenthood, and I'm trying to put myself in
Every
the
day.
mind every single day.
Every day.
And you're trying to put yourself into the mind, like, okay, like, you might, kind of have these like stray thoughts where you're like, oh man, like, what about, I don't know, the environment or whatever, like maybe tying those things back into parenthood, like
Mhm,
trying to figure out, okay, if I'm
mhm.
thinking about the environment, like how is that going to tie into this parenthood poem about this specific aspect. And something that is interesting, man. We did this show a couple weeks ago, and it was actually really interesting because it was my first time ever doing this. It was a poetry show, but it was like a poetry show, and then like the other performer, there was like a poetry show that was intertwined with improv.
That's
And
difficult.
yeah, it was a little strange,
It's a
but
difficult.
I think one of the things that I realized about myself, about the way that I create, is I think in because a lot of my poems are like persona poems, but I think a lot of times like in scenarios, like I'm not even necessarily thinking of like maybe the point of the poem until it's done.
Yeah.
Until I'm like, okay, the poem is done. Like, what was the point here? But I'm like, I'm really thinking of like, man, this is the scenario. I did this poem, and it was like this character just walks out of this place, and it was like these like kind of oddball. I can't really like announce, like I can't really like say what it is. I don't think the thing hasn't released yet, but um like I kind of put these two things together, but I found like, okay, that's a thing that I do. I mean, I have the Denzel Washington poem. Matter of fact, like it's like, it's like essentially like I put Denzel Washington into this scenario, and then the poem came from it. I didn't, to be honest with you, like I wasn't even necessarily thinking of like a message for the poem to be saying.
Mhm.
I was just thinking like that's an interesting two things to put together. Um
Also,
or
gotta see where it goes. Kind of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like and
Hmm.
that's kind of like the
Hmm.
I think the fun that's the fun thing for me when it comes to poetry, because it's like, I also don't know where this poem is going.
Hmm.
Like I
Hmm.
as shocked as y'all might be as far as like what happens in this poem, I too was, when I first wrote it, and I was like, okay, like what is this person going to be doing? Like how is this thing going to be
That's a
like
very common
happening?
refrain in writing that, right? Like if you
Yeah.
don't learn something new by the end of your poem, then the poem's not done.
Yeah. Or or it's so I would say if you're not learning something new, then it's probably fairly derivative. And you probably, and I'm not to say that like, every single thing I write is like some kind of like, fresh, leaf that's never grown, you know what I mean? But it's just to say that the thing that I'm trying to do at the very least, and maybe I'm failing, but maybe I'm succeeding, is I'm trying to think of something that I have not thought before. And I'm like, I haven't thought about this thought ever in my life
Hmm.
before. Where does this go? Where does this take me? And yeah, like I think that's like kind of when you're kind of creating something, and especially when you're kind of talking about like kind of this like more of like kind of focused thing when it comes to your, like if you're writing a collection, it's like, yeah, like you can still be just as like genuinely shocked by your work, but like make sure it's in a specific direction. Just like put yourself in the scenario that you need to be writing within, and then maybe like add some kind of new element that maybe it's a very odd juxtaposition.